order the September 24th meeting of the Reimagining Public Safety Committee. Thanks as always to everyone for joining. If I could ask folks who aren't speaking to mute themselves, because I think we're getting a little bit of feedback, that would be awesome. And thank you as always to the group for both the various participants and the members of the public for being a part of this. As always, we'll begin with public comments. Is there any member of the public who would like to give a public comment? You can either just speak up or raise your hand, use the raise your hand function in Zoom. Seeing none, we can move to the next item on our agenda, which is approval of the August 31st. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed somebody. Doreen Price for a public comment. Ms. Price, are you able to unmute yourself and make your comment?
Yes, now, sorry, thank you.
Great.
I had been doing reading because of Lake County, starting with initiatives that are part of a program that your group may or may not have discussed already. And I want to pull up that reference. And so my comment will be short in terms of trying to get you this reference. It's called the PPI build. And there's an engine associated with it, and it's part of the, have you heard of it? It's has to do, Betty can help me out on this one. I've been sending her stuff and I've been trying to catch up on it.
Well, you know,
it's basically called the prosecutorial performance indicators, and it's part of a community building situation funded by the MacArthur Group, and Cook County is part of it, which means Evanston could possibly get funds or be associated with this. And so they give guidelines on really good suggestions as to what communities can do to work toward healing, and also in terms of looking at in terms of prosecutorial activity. We even have that at the local level, and to look at that in conjunction with where we want to be as a community. And those questions were raised up indirectly at the city council meeting yesterday. So it ties in. And is there a text I can send this via text to somebody, and then you can have a copy?
Sure. I mean, if you're able to email it, that might be easier, because then I can forward it to the whole committee.
Okay,
and everyone has a chance
I'll try to figure it out.
it.
I have Android was easier than iPhone.
Oh.
So anyway, I'll do that. And so, but I'll be listening in, and thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you for your comment. And like I said, is whenever you send something over, we'll make sure the whole committee gets a chance to see it, and I'm sure I'll look forward to studying it. So thank you.
Yes, someone may have already seen it, and if not, it's really timely because Lake County is already has jumped on it, and Cook County's listed. So there's really good tie-ins with whatever we want to do as a community, which would be cool. So yeah, okay.
Great, thank you. So
You're welcome.
The next agenda item is approval of the August 31st, 2021 meeting minutes. Would anyone like to move approval of the minutes?
So moved.
Patrick Keenan-Devlin moves approval of the August 31st, 2021 meeting minutes. Does anyone second the motion?
I'll second that.
Councilmember Reed seconds the motion. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed? The ayes have it, and the minutes are adopted. Next, you'll remember last week we had a presentation from the ACLU that took the full hour, and so we bumped from our agenda hearing from our working groups, which means that we've missed a week, a couple weeks of updates, and I think there's really important and exciting stuff for those groups to share. So let me start with the violence prevention working group, where I know that since our last meeting, Evangeline stepped in and shared their most recent, led their most recent discussion, and she and Andy have worked on a document and some ideas. And I'm not sure if the two of you have worked out the question of who wants to provide the report, but one or both of you, we'd love to hear what you guys have been up to.
Thanks. I've been voluntold to kind of report back, but I'm happy to do it on the behalf of our committee members. Also, big thanks to Evangeline, Nathan, Cicely, the rest of the team that has all contributed. So I'm just kind of reporting back. So we've actually we've been developing two major lines of thought. I want to start by saying, our group continues to acknowledge roughly the three different sort of levels when we're talking about violence prevention: the sort of intervention short term, the prevention midterm, and the truly transformative. We believe we continue to have to focus on all three. Yet our group, as you've heard us say before, are going to focus specifically on intervention, on the sort of the on the ground, immediate harm and trauma. I will also say that some of the other group members, the data group and so on, Sean and colleagues and I have been trying to answer some questions that we don't have yet. So I'll just report back at a high level of what we've been trying to do. So we've been kind of branching out in two of lots of areas to think about things, assets and opportunities in Evanston that we could improve to really make some strides and reimagine in this space. And the two we're going to talk about very, very briefly here. We're not ready to report back any formal documents or presentations. Are street or neighborhood outreach, which looks at those who are most deeply involved in disputes that lead to violence, including things like the homicides and shootings that we experience, as well as victim services and survivors of violent crime. So we've been branching off in these two areas, trying to get a grip on the current state of things in Evanston, as well as think about best practices and other potential opportunities to innovate. And so again, thanks to Nathan and everybody else who really, we sat down and pulled out the markers and started doing these things, trying to figure out, who's most immediately in harm's way. And again, this is nothing that hasn't been said to many times in different spaces in Evanston or in other things, but a lot of the interpersonal violence is driven by a small number of individuals. We don't want to give a number per se, but it's not a lot, somewhere between 25 to 50. There are a lot of old neighborhood, family, crew disputes that spill over into school, that spill over into public places, that spill over into homes. But we believe it's still a relatively small number of individuals and cliques and things that are involved. And one of the strategies we've been talking about here since day one, and Evanston is grateful enough to have some experts in this space, is this idea of street or neighborhood outreach, which is using broadly credible messengers, people with lived experience, to reach out to those in harm's way. And so we've been trying to understand what assets Evanston currently has, and there are full-time outreach workers, for example, but we're also trying to understand best practice. We have some resources and experts on our committee, but also have been looking to other places. And we've been trying to look at some of the new leading models that don't just figure out how to reach hard to reach individuals, which again is this traditionally this credible messengers model, people that have lived experience, but also thinking about ways that we can go from that intervention to that transformative level with individuals and families by potentially wrapping in outreach with programming, services, stipends. And we're seeing movement on these sorts of phased immediate programming in cities, including Chicago, but also other cities, Sacramento, Oakland, Baltimore, Boston, that are extremely promising. And so one subgroup of the subgroup has been exploring what a model like this might look like in Evanston. How do we reach these individuals? What skills and trainings do the workers that are doing the work need? We wanted to stress, you don't want to set people up to fail. If you say you're going to do it, they have to have resources and support to do it. And then what sorts of opportunities in Evanston do we have, say, for life coaching, cognitive behavioral therapy, job placement, and so on? So Nathan, myself, and a few others are starting to think and look and create some ideas that we hope to bring back to this committee. So one strand is to continue to look at street outreach or neighborhood outreach and what the needs are and what we have and what we could potentially do. The good news here is, again, there's a lot of innovation happening in this space, so we're not starting from scratch, including things happening from small and mid-sized cities and not just Chicago and big cities. So that's the street outreach, neighborhood outreach branch. The victim services branch, I will not do Evangeline's work justice here either. And I don't want to take any credit for it. I actually have now a detailed history of victim services in Evanston and Cook County. I'm a super nerd, so I love that kind of stuff, but I want to also just stress it's really important to understand that history as it is with street outreach, so we don't kind of just repeat it. Really, some of the key questions which Evangeline presented earlier in this larger group were these ideas of, making sense and following blueprints in this space from other states, other counties, also understanding the nested nature of city, county, state, understanding who is a crime victim, what's a violent crime, and importantly, who's a survivor, and understanding, as with this outreach, centering and focusing on who's in immediate harm. In this case, make sure we're centering survivors and their families as the core of this work. And here it's also important to make these distinctions between people who are directly harmed and survive. I should just want to point out most there are about 5 or 6 non-fatal gunshot injuries for every fatal gunshot injury. So there are lots of people that are living with the actual direct harm. They're the witnesses and the trauma and the family, the people that experience it indirectly. And then of course, there's the rest of the community, which also, so there's many, many levels. And here, Evangeline has already talked about it, but we're starting to again explore what are best practices in this space when we start talking about things like victim assistance. As with the outreach space, one of the themes we're kind of continuing to see, or at least emerging in Evanston, is that there are lots of resources, but lining these things up and understanding that somebody who does, say, youth outreach might not be best person to do, say, street outreach, or people who do youth services might not be the right person to do victim services. There are very particular skills that are needed to address victim services. You have to have trauma-informed care. You have to know what to say and not to say. And you have to have the particular link to those best practices. So that's where we've left it in both of these spaces, to try to really have a sense of, what do we think we have that we can build off of, what's needed. And we hope to report back more on those spaces, because Evanston does have a lot of these things in different places, in public and private spaces, but lining them up. And this is kind of one of the things we're seeing at a national level in other spaces, is trying to create, a nice a system or pipeline or program, regardless, one of these things and these different things. So those are the 2 places we've started. We plan to go in other places as well, but we felt like we wanted to dig in. Let me pause, Nathan, Evangeline in particular, but anybody from the committee, have I missed anything? I mean, I have. Have I missed anything crucial, I suppose, that you wanted to raise?
No, you really hit all the points, and I truly appreciate you just annotating everything. One time, a meeting ago or 2 meetings ago, you did mention a sort of model that pays the most at risk or most opportunity youth or young adults for their participation. If you could just harp on that last point is the only thing I would mention. I think that's a really great model is all.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So Nathan, there's a few models emerging across the country, 2 in Chicago, but some that have been done in California, Baltimore, Boston. The idea when you have street outreach or neighborhood outreach, right, is you have these credible messengers. We know without a doubt they can find the right people, right? We know this uniformly. They know these networks, they know the neighborhoods, they know families, they can find people. We also know they're very good at connecting them to things. To go from this immediate locating folks to try to some transformative level at an individual, what people have been innovating is starting with outreach and creating a phased set of programming. And some of these include, some of the models are Chicago Cred, Ready Chicago, ROCA, Advanced Peace, and I'm happy to provide links for some of these. But the idea is once you have them, you get them to commit to a program, 12, 18 months, and it's phased, and it has lots of the things that individuals who've experienced trauma or violence and are living with it and are in harm's way need. So again, I'm just going to throw some out in no particular order: life coaching, cognitive behavioral therapy, skills development, job readiness, job placement. And some of the most promising programs also included stipends, monthly stipends. So people are there was actually an op-ed today by David Muhammad in San Francisco Examiner, maybe it was yesterday, about this idea that you are actually paying people to do a program, and that is important while they're in the program, and just as important, some of the models are showing, is making sure there's something at the end, right? One of the things we know about transitional jobs or summer jobs is they work during the transition or the summer, but if they're not sustainable and you don't have family sustaining wages, the effect will be short term. So this is one of the things. Thanks, Nathan. Thank you for raising that. We were starting to think about, all right, if we can find him, then what? And that's kind of where we moved from just, trying to lower a count of injuries to creating real transformation and figuring out what the particular Evanston variety of that might look like. But it's a small number of individuals, which is good in terms of when we think of scale or what it would take.
And I think the only thing I would add is that we talked about also looking at both youth services, victim services, and how, the existing teams might need to clarify what they do and how they work together, and really be specific about services that are provided, what they hope to provide, what they actually don't provide, being really clear so that people are aware. There are times, and we talked about this in our work group, that there might be a need for both, right? Youth services would need to show up and support someone who is a harm doer, and victim services would need to show up to support someone who's harmed. And so being really clear about what that looks like and what that, how the teams could coalesce in a reimagined situation. So that's some of the pieces. We were not only looking at the separate tracks, but how they would work together, and possibly, be more clear with the community about the services and the functions of each.
Great. Thank you so much to all three of you. It's really, really powerful stuff. Does any questions for the violence prevention group from the committee? Okay, well, it's really, like I said, there's lots there and lots for us to work on together. So thank you again. I think I'm going to go next, just reporting back from the data patrol and traffic group. We continue to hear from a variety of different voices around traffic enforcement. I believe since the last report out, we heard both from rank and file EPD officers, and then from the chief legislative aide to the mayor of Berkeley, California, which is trying to rethink their traffic enforcement. And the message from the aide, Tano Trachtenfeld, who we heard from, was pretty, I would say the message was like, hey, listen, guys, the newspaper is saying that we're ending law enforcement involvement in traffic enforcement. And that's like a really good newspaper story, but actually we're not doing that yet, in part because California law doesn't allow us to, but in part because we're doing a whole bunch of other things around traffic that are equally impactful that don't make it into the newspaper. And they're a whole series of kind of civil justice related changes that they're engaged in, primarily around the elimination of pretextual stops, around the kind of establishment of a clear set of protocols that says, hey, yeah, look, on the one hand, the state law kind of allows us to pull over almost anyone, almost any time. Almost every vehicle is in violation of something in the state code at any given time. But we as a city, they've decided, are going to be very clear about delineating what traffic stops occur for reasons of traffic safety, and limiting stops to those purposes. We're going to be hearing in the meeting after next from folks in Philadelphia who are doing some similar work. And I would just say at this point, we've done a good job of getting a library of different reform options, both kind of like, here's the going all the way version and here are some intermediate versions, but also kind of here are approaches that are, have this particular set of goals, here are approaches that have that particular set of goals. And so forth. And we've done, learned a lot from a variety of different voices inside the police department as well. And we're also, as I've indicated, we've had access to an awful lot of data. Thanks very much to Sarah Jones for providing us with that. And so I think we're, just to kind of look ahead, I think we're not one meeting away, but probably between 2 and 4 meetings away from synthesizing all this into a menu of concrete options that we might want to consider and bring back to this committee. And I think there is really exciting opportunity here that that could be really achievable, right? Like doesn't require massive structural reform to the institution of EPD, but could be impactful, make a real difference, both in terms of alleviating some of the challenges that bring us into this discussion, and also in terms of redirecting EPD's resources to the critical public safety challenges that that I think most of us would like to see as their primary focus. I know these reports have been sort of intermediate. That's what they are by definition. So acknowledging that there isn't sort of a punchline yet, do folks have questions about kind of what we've heard about so far, or questions that you'd like us to have in mind as we continue to do this work going forward? Okay, we'll be back to you with more. And I hear from Councilmember Burns, who chairs the Re-envisioning the Organizational Structure of the EPD group, that he's asked Patrick to do today's report out. So Patrick, Keenan-Devlin, take it away.
Great. So Councilmember Burns texted me at 3, or what time is it? At 3:59, saying, "Hey, can you give the report?" So I will try not to ramble because I don't have notes about what I'm supposed to say. But I think the 2 things that I would just emphasize that we've worked on the most, and please, somebody who's also on the working group, chime in if you have better working memory than I do. But the 2 things that I think we've really keyed in on most recently is bringing in staff from Peer Services, including the Executive Director, Maureen McDonnell, to help us better understand what it would take to provide on-demand substance abuse treatment for individuals that are most likely stopped by the Evanston Police Department and or fire department and transported either directly to a hospital or to an alternative setting, and what that could look like. And I think that was brought up in the context of Councilmember Reed's concept of decriminalizing certain levels of drug usage and possession in our city. So that's one area that we've keyed in on. The second, at the prompting of Councilmember Burns, is unpacking further what it actually means to be a police officer. Are there statutory obligations that police officers have? We've heard about this thing called a peace officer. Well, what's that? And what's that in comparison to that of a law enforcement officer? I did the legal research along with 2 of my law clerks here at the Moran Center. Our ultimate conclusion is there's a lot of gray between these 2 roles, but at the end of the day, the distinction does not seem extensive. And plus, we also learned that all law enforcement officers are peace officers, but not all peace officers are law enforcement officers. So if you didn't know that before today, now you know. So that's one big key takeaway. But what we do with that information, I have to admit, is unclear to me. But so those are 2 key areas we have keyed into thus far. Other working group members, anything to add to that? Allison is shaking her head. But she had a screaming toddler at the last meeting, so I don't know how much she heard. Poor Allison. All been there. We've all been there.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great summary. I do think there is significance to some of the discussion that we had and potential differences between peace officers and law enforcement officers. And I think we're going to continue. I know that your opinion, Patrick, but I think it seems like the committee is going to continue looking into that a bit. And, can we have, I think one of the important things is if we, is there a way that we can craft, a public safety or public accountability force that does not have the same responsibilities as law enforcement. And one of the key descriptors that came out for a peace officer is that, hey, if a peace officer is Patrick, you may have the language better than I, but something along the lines of, if a peace officer serves essentially as a law enforcement officer for a year, they become a law enforcement officer. If they're out patrolling streets and they're putting their life in danger full time for a year, they become a law enforcement. So the question is, are there workarounds to that? Can we have part of their time not, be the enforcement of crime, or can we structure this potentially in a way that we have similar to our property standards folks who go out and enforce code? Can we have another, as we're thinking about restructuring the organization, is there the potential to have some other force that is similar but responds to code violations and issues within our city in a manner that is different than the traditional law enforcement response?
Great, thank you. Thanks very much to both of you. It's really great.
Yeah.
Any questions for Councilmember Reed or for Patrick?
One quick question, Mr. Mayor. So Patrick, you have stated that all law enforcement officers are peace officers, but not all peace officers are law enforcement officers, correct? I just want to make sure I had that down.
That is correct. And I had a really geeky conversation with the general counsel of the Illinois Police Training Board, who obviously loves talking about the Illinois Police Training Act, which I have to admit before this committee I had never read. But really in his mind, it's very simple. And I think it is actually more complex than this. But from his perspective, it's simple in that law enforcement officers are required to go through 560 hours of training that is training approved by the Illinois Police Training Board. Whereas peace officers, if they want to be equipped with a firearm, they have to go through only the 40-hour fire and ammunition training, which is specifically for peace officers and parole officers in the state of Illinois. And there's a whole separate act called the Illinois Peace Officer and Parole Probation Officer Firearm Training Act. So that was in his mind the big distinction between there are other distinctions, like for example, Nathan, I mean, when we're talking about, sorry, I'm getting my notes in front of me. For example, other examples of peace officers, a coroner, for example, is a peace officer and is not required to go through law enforcement training under the Illinois Police Training Act. But to Councilmember Reed's point, for example, if the coroner was fulfilling the role essentially of a law enforcement officer for a year, they would actually ostensibly be a law enforcement officer. So I feel like I'm rambling, but hopefully somewhere in that rambling, I answered your question.
No, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we have our corporation counsel with us, Nick Cummings, who is going to be a key guest speaker on our next agenda item, but also has a response, I think, to Nathan's question here.
It was more of a question for Patrick. And when you spoke with the head of the the training academy, did he give you any insight as to the definition under the Illinois Administrative Code, which sort of indicates that law enforcement officers can be peace officers who've been employed for at least a year?
He did not, though I also found that administrative code. Now, what did I do with it?
As Councilmember Burns shared your memo with me, and that was the question that I had for him is, okay, we've identified someone as a peace officer, but they've been a peace officer for longer than a year. Does the Illinois Administrative Code now treat them as law enforcement officers?
I did not specifically ask him that question, though. As you referenced, I placed that in my memo just because I was like, oh, look at that, look at that section.
Yeah.
But I did not specifically ask him. I could follow up. He was a really wonderful man who was willing to actually take a lot of time to talk to me and share his expertise. So I'm sure I could go back to him on that.
I think the information regarding the hours of training is probably the best indicia. But I was just curious, like,
I think that's right.
It's defined in the administrative code that if you're employed for a year, all of a sudden you're a law enforcement officer. So I just want to ask that question. Thank you.
No, thank you.
If I can just chime in, and Patrick, I appreciate all of your time on this, but I think one of the things that's interesting about that, and I think that kind of demonstrates the answer to that, is the fact, like you said, a coroner or a probation officer, that there are all these folks that are peace officers, but because they're not performing, I think the specific language was, there's something specific about the harm that you're placed in during your time, and it's about the full time being a peace officer. So I think it kind of plays out and answers that just having the title peace officer for a year and being full-time employed maybe does not, given what your specific duties are.
Yeah. And unfortunately, what we also found, I promised Daniel, this is the last thing I'll say. See, I didn't even prepare, and I'm talking your ears off. I think this is what I would say, is that in our research, and I hope Council Cummings would agree with me, that a lot of this stuff has been decided by our courts. And, if you read these appellate court opinions, attempting to distinguish between peace officer and law enforcement officer, and who was playing what role when, it's incredibly subjective, and they're reading tea leaves, and they're interpreting administrative code versus statute, and I think they're attempting in every opinion that they render to make less gray, but there's a lot of gray here. And so if the city moved towards reimagining the police force and having it be viewed as peace officers, I think we would just have to be thoughtful about that, and recognizing that there is a lot of gray here that we would probably have to let play out in some way within the courts, because that's what has happened to date in the state of Illinois, at least.
Illinois is not known for, no offense to former legislative icon Daniel Biss, but the Illinois General Assembly is not known for clear legislation out of Springfield.
It doesn't seem so.
That is true. All right, so we're way behind, but Ms. Esther has raised her hand. So Ms. Esther, I'll give you the last word on this topic, and then we'll move on to the next agenda item.
Right. I have a question, and you don't need to answer, but I think we need to think about this. We are talking about some category or some measure of reclassifying our officers as we know them as now. Will we be looking at, and since a lot of this is settled in the court, and also with the union, to determine the pay status? So that's something I think we should look at. Okay, if we changing everybody to this, will that cause us to change the pay status? That's something we should think about, and maybe in the next couple of meetings, we can discuss that.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more. And I think, frankly, Ms. Esther, I think those are among many, many, many kind of important concrete questions that arise if the interest of the group is to go in this direction. So yeah, I think you're right on the specifics, and you're right in the generalities as well. There's a lot to be said in that area. So thank you. So let's move on to the next agenda item, which is, broadly speaking, a debrief of the ACLU presentation. I want to spend the bulk of this time getting the sense of the committee, but just to give, I'm going to start with a 30-second recap and then turn it over to the Corporation Council. The ACLU presented what they were kind of promoting as a model that they saw as very successful in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The idea there being to pass a super ambitious, far-reaching, relatively high-level resolution saying, here's kind of what the end state looks like. And then now that we've passed it, we've got a million specific implementation projects that that we're gonna then have to figure out how to do. I wanted the Corporation Council to speak to at least two questions around this. First of all, the issue was raised 2 weeks ago of like, what do you really accomplish with a resolution? You know, it's not really binding. What, you know, is it actually useful to pass a resolution laying out the intended end state, or is that just kind of a waste of time because resolutions aren't, you know, strictly speaking, binding? And then the second question is that the particular resolution that was passed in Brooklyn Center included a lot of reorganization of their city government, creation of new departments, abolition of certain departments, mergers of certain departments, all kinds of like managerial stuff. And I'm always cautious in our form of government to ensure that I'm keeping track of what kinds of decisions are the purview of city council, the body that we're ultimately advising, and what kind of decisions are really left to the city manager to execute. And so I wanted the Corporation Council to speak again, both to sort of the kind of legal and also historical implications of this resolution approach, and then also, you know, what is within our purview and what is clearly out of our purview and what's kind of a gray area or maybe in dual purview. So with that, Mr. Cummings.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nicholas Cummings, Corporation Counsel for the City of Evanston. With respect to resolutions, and I've had extensive discussion about resolutions with Councilmember Burns actually over the last week and what they represent. Resolutions are commitments and actions of the city by way of the City Council taking action. So while they, you know, in theory may not have the quote unquote force of law, they are something that it's expected that the city is actually going to do or is doing. And one of the strongest examples I use with that is the creation of the city's reparation fund was done by a resolution. And the city has actually stuck to that commitment. It's really up to the city to fulfill those commitments. Another example would be the delivery caps on the individual delivery services, Grubhub, Uber Eats, etc. That was also a resolution, and those organizations have followed that commitment. Even though it was a resolution, they followed that commitment to limit their delivery caps to 15%. So resolutions can still be forceful and can be impactful, used properly. And I don't know the form of government that Brooklyn Center has, if they even have, you know, the forms that Illinois has, whether it be a commission, city manager, or a mayor-led form of government. I do know that some of their commitments, they were sort of aggressive, and in Evanston, those lines are a little easier to demarcate, and I don't know would be proper under a resolution. So, for example, to create new departments, that's certainly within the purview of City Council to create a new department. That would have to be done actually by ordinance. And so they would need to pass a city ordinance in order to create a new department. The catch, however, is that department would still fall under the city manager's office. And so the city manager will be tasked with appointing the head of that new department. How it could be structured initially when it's formed would be up to City Council. But again, it would be ran and managed by the city manager and his or her designee. As well as the policies and implementation of the policies and how the department is run would be managed by the city manager. City Council can certainly make recommendations and give direction to the city manager. After all, the city manager serves at the pleasure of City Council. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that in our current form of government, that would be under the purview of the city manager's office to make those ultimate decisions. There are some things that the City Council, and an example of how this actually could work if you did create a new department, there are certain duties of the chief of police, for example, are designated under the city code and the creation of the police department and the creation of the chief of police, the office of the chief of police. So some of those policies and practices that I mentioned would be under the purview of the city manager's office are actually designated to the chief of police in our city code with the approval of the city manager. So that would also have to be the same thing done here if we wanted a model similar to what the ACLU did in Brooklyn City or Brooklyn Center, sorry. city council could create new departments, could, create the structure, designate certain authority and power, but ultimately at the end of the day in Illinois, under Article 5, that would fall under the city manager's office.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Before we get to discussing the substance of this question, does anyone have any follow-up questions for Mr. Cummings? Great, thank you. Again, that was really, really helpful. I'm supposed to be pretending that that was helpful to me and that it explained things to other people that I already knew, but in fact, it was helpful to me as well, helping to educate me about this job that I seem to have. So with that, I'm curious to hear feedback. I think the ACLU case was basically, if you make a bold commitment that lays out the endpoint of your work, you commit yourself to it in public, you create accountability mechanisms, and you frankly drive external support and funding to your implementation efforts, because you set yourself apart from the many communities that are kind of talking about public safety reform, but haven't committed to the that level of boldness. I think others in this group may also feel that, candidly, maybe a weakness of our efforts has been that we haven't been clear and unanimous about our end goals. And so that's left us doing good work, but not always sure about where we want to be getting to, and having a resolution like this would solve that problem. I think on the flip side, there's the question of, what is the difficulty in achieving something like this? And given that it isn't really fully binding, what do we get out of it? And how far are we from having unanimity around what our goals are? And so to what extent is it really possible to go down this path? And I'm sure there are arguments on both sides beyond those, but I think those sort of summarize kind of what I heard 2 weeks ago. And so with that, I'd love to hear feedback about whether this is an approach folks want to, emulate closely, discard altogether, or take certain features of and run with. So with that, let me open the floor.
Mayor Biss, could you do me a favor and could you pose the question again, please, just briefly?
Yeah, what do you think about this approach? Do you think we ought to do it? Do you think we ought to just not do it? Or do you think there's aspects of it we should borrow, but do it in a very different way than was done in Brooklyn Center?
And that's the form of government, correct?
No. That's this strategy of writing out a resolution that says, here's what we want to do. Here's what victim services are going to look like when our work is finished. Here's what traffic enforcement is going to look like when our work is finished. Here's what a new Department of Public Safety, et cetera, to kind of describe at a high level where we're going, not put every nut and every bolt in an ordinance that completes the work, but sort of lays out, kind of paints a picture of where we're going. So the idea is, well, hey, once you've done that, then you've got a much clearer work plan, and you've sort of committed yourself to walk that path.
Got you. No, I like that. I was distracted by email. I apologize, but I certainly like certain aspects of it for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in. And again, I think I agree with Mr. Norman, who I see on every time I get online, I see his face on an ad for Oakton. But I agree. I like aspects of it. I think one of the things that I don't like is I've noticed the tendency of both the city of Evanston particularly and just governing bodies generally, that when we pass resolutions, we sometimes feel placated just by passing a resolution, and we don't take the next step to actual action and laying something concrete and ordinance, something that is binding and commits us to that. And I think, even with, the great work we've done with reparations, part of it is we've passed a resolution that said, hey, we're going to commit $10 million, but we haven't actually found where we're going to get the $10 million from. And so I just don't, I think continuing the work and actually coming together and getting an ordinance that goes before the council, is helpful. And I think a resolution may be a distraction.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
If I may hop in, I think passing a resolution would be admirable. I think what's popping into my mind right now is that we currently have a great interim city manager in Kelly Gandersky, and it is my assumption that we will soon be going on a city manager search. So in line with
And just to interject, in the interests of saying an important thing in public, that your assumption is correct.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. Sorry.
There's no interrupting.
And with what Corporation Counsel Mr. Cummings shared with us, I think it's important for us as the committee to keep in mind that regardless whether we make conservative or ambitious recommendations at the end or along the lines of this the term of this committee, that we will have to work with both our police department and our city manager to make sure that what we recommend is feasible and can happen. And I just think I think I just have that in mind. So I think it's very ambitious. I like aspects of it. And those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ester, is your hand up again, or is it still up from the previous time? I apologize
No,
for
it's up again. I do take it down. In terms of making resolutions and deciding things, even looking at and talking about the Brooklyn, what they did. I have read some of it, and one of the things, and as you always know, I come from the point of view is what is the public? What is the residents? How are they seeing this? How is this going to affect them? We are 17, 20 people in this group that will come out and say, oh, we want this resolution. But then we will have, I don't know what the number of residents we should come out with a number, but we will have a segment out there that has not been to these meetings or have been to these meetings that have not spoken up and feel left out, or that, okay, here's something else we're going to get jammed down our throat. One of the things that the ACLU did stress, and I hope that we take to heart, is that they had the community involved, because the problems that was happening in Brooklyn and the things that happened there was because nobody was bothering to talk to the resident. All we want you to do, hey, you pay your taxes. Did you pay your fine, or did what you were supposed to do in terms of supporting the city? But then nobody is asking them, hey, what can we do with you? Are we giving you what you need? Or are you seeing things that should not be happening? And we are talking about making changes, and good or bad, to the law enforcement thing. Hopefully it will come out to be good, very good. but that will only be determined is by how the residents accept it. So we have to also think and be creative to say, okay, here, this is what we got. Now we got to go out and sell it to to the people out in the community and get them to buy on and accept it. Otherwise, it will be council make a decision and you have to live with this. And they look at it, yes, no, I don't, I can move away. So, which we hope that they will not, but we need to start including the residents in the conversations of things that are made. And if you want to look at a community that really does that, look at in Portland, Oregon and stuff, any and every decision that they make or come up before the city council and things are developers to develop anything in their community, they sit down with the residents in that community and have a discussion on it. And when it comes back and they approve it, one thing that they have found that they are, one, saving money in terms of the developer is getting something that he needs and he don't have to do, which saves him money, which also turns out that the city will gain money. So we have to, and I'm sorry it comes down to the dollar, but that's kind of what we are in terms of the city government. Do we have enough money to sponsor these programs? Are these programs we doing will ask us to put a burden on the residents? So they are good, they sound good, but we need to be also thinking in that light. And if you don't, then we're not going to come up with a good program.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. And now to Betty Bog. So, Betty Bog, did you put your hand down?
I put my hand down and didn't take myself off mute because I still don't have that skill. Failed. I was really compelled by the ACLU's presentation when they gave it, and I'm a big proponent of stating your objective boldly, because until you name it, it will not happen. And I certainly don't have enough technical knowledge to know whether a proclamation or an ordinance or what the best mechanism for achieving that goal is. I think I'm running the risk probably of being too practical about this, but I have seen so many times the perfect getting in the way of the good, and the paralysis that can occur when we wait for the absolutely perfect answer, I think is really detrimental to any movement. And so I would just urge us to consider what we can get done. Like if it's an ordinance and that can happen and something else cannot happen, it is sort of it just seems philosophical to me to make the difference between the two words. I would just urge us to land on the side of action.
Great. Point well taken. We're coming up on 5. Is there? But there's definitely quite a few folks who haven't. Oh, Patrick.
I was very lukewarm either way, but I tend to make it a policy never to disagree with Betty Bog. So I think the point that she just made is incredibly compelling. So I am convinced now that we should state our objective, and I think it could be done via resolution.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there others who want to speak? Because I know there's quite a few folks who are members of the committee and haven't yet spoken, and I want to give room for everybody. Okay, what I hear is not a consensus or close to it. What I hear is some pretty powerful arguments on both sides. I'm gonna suggest that we leave it in the following way. We have these 3 working groups. They're all moving forward. They're all doing real work. I think the Betty Bog point is a legitimate assessment of what's going on with all of them, which is that they're all moving forward, and let's do this with maritime metaphors. They're all ships at sea, and the shore is not yet visible, and there's a lot of peril, therefore, that lies between where they currently are and the port. Maybe that metaphor wasn't worth it, now that I think about it. So I'm a little hesitant, notwithstanding the last 2 comments, to kind of try to corral the group where I think at least based on who spoke up today, maybe a small majority lies on the other side, into kind of turning our work into a single one-size-fits-all giant resolution with all of our goals in it. But what I propose to do is to work with all 3 groups in the immediate future to find the right mechanism for those groups to set out goals for their work. That can be in the form of a resolution. It can be in the form of a document that we publish. It can be in the form of something else. But I think we've done enough at this point, and we've had enough both information gathering and time for thinking, that it's appropriate now for us to say, like, let's translate this work and these efforts and these discussions into a set of goals that we can then, in whatever format we do them, make them public enough that we can use them to hold ourselves accountable. It's 5 o'clock, so we're going to break, but I'll put that sort of statement in writing. Happy to take feedback and criticism and change course if that doesn't work for folks. But I think at this point, that strikes me as the right happy medium. And I think it's a doable project given where we are in the work. So with that, think as we did last week, we'll skip the last agenda item, which is I put on the agenda knowing that this might happen, so I'm not too torn up about it. Thank you very much all for your time and attention to this. It is clear to me that we are making real progress, that we've more work ahead than we do behind us, but nonetheless that we're on a really meaningful and productive path. So that's thanks to everyone's engagement. I appreciate it a great deal. With that, the September 14th meeting of the Reimagining Public Safety Committee stands adjourned, and